forms weren't addressed as a result of this settlement. So Anywhere, Remax, KW, Home Services of America, all settled somewhere in the tune of about, let's see, 250 million for Home Services of America, 70 million for Remax, 55 million for, no, I'm sorry, 70 million for Keller Williams, 55 million for Remax, and 83 million for Anywhere. So, obviously the settlement is north of 600 million now at this point. So yesterday we talked about kind of what that means in terms of form changes and what that impact looks like. And today I'd really like to talk openly about the impact of the settlement. So I'm sure all of you are hearing lots of information from lots of different sources. One being, we're not going to get paid anymore. It's going to be very difficult to get paid. And let's kind of dispel that notion right now. I don't think it's going to be any more difficult to get paid than, how we get paid now, to be honest with you. Obviously time will tell. But, as we've said over and over again, it really is going to depend on how you articulate your value to a customer these days. So I want to ask openly, how many of you are working with buyers right now? Scott, I know you are.
I've got one right now, in the middle.
In the middle, right? Who else is working with buyers? Oh, Scott, by the way, we're official in California. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Right on, brother.
Yay.
Yay.
Haley, what brokerage are you with and what are you doing right now in your business? I think it's Haley. Good morning, Haley. All right, Haley's on mute. I'm going to switch to you, Letty. Letty, I know you're about 50-50 right now.
Yeah, so I'm with Aspire. Yeah, we are about 50-50. I would say my team does more on buyer, and then me with some of the other agents, we have a little more of the listings.
Mm-hmm.
But even with sellers, I'm having conversations around buyer compensation, and that's all still happening. It's definitely a present conversation. Absolutely.
So you talked about, having conversations with sellers. It affects everybody, guys. I mean, yes, the buyers specifically are the ones who are coming up with the additional monies potentially, but the conversation absolutely starts with those of you who are listing agents. It starts with the seller. It's really about Mr. and Mrs. Seller. This is why I think you should continue to pay for buyer representation and kind of what that language looks like. Grace, how about you? What market are you in, and are you working with buyers or sellers? Are you with me, Grace? Grace may be driving. Yeah, Grace may be driving. So, what's going to change? Obviously, the way we service our customers is going to significantly change. So those of you who've worked with buyers in your career, know that typically as we work with a buyer, we simply, kind of throw them in our car 90% of the time. In previous iterations, we've even failed to establish a complete agency agreement. In other words, a buyer enters into a conversation with us. That conversation becomes less than casual. In other words, they start to talk specifics about real estate, which then engages our license, and we're off to the races. We're so happy we've got a customer. We're wanting to, show them everything that's on the market. We put them on a drip campaign that floods them or their emails with everything that's on the market. And then we feel like we've got a customer. A month later or 2 months later, that customer says, I'm not ready yet. I'm going to wait and do it with somebody else. 4 months after that, they end up buying a house with someone else and telling you, oh, I found the dream house and I couldn't get in touch with you, or some variant of that, right? You guys are familiar with that. So, where we are right now is I think this creates a real opportunity to solidify the work that you do with your customer base. It's going to force you just purely by its mechanisms to actually sit down and have actual conversations with your buyers about what their true ability is to afford. As a matter of fact, there are two forms specifically, which is one is a financial and personal information document that was introduced into car forms. And then the other one is basically just preferences and learning about specifics of what the buyer is actually looking for. So as we look at that simple change in the landscape, what does that mean for you from a day-to-day? We know that going forward, starting in July, all of you, so here at Radius, we're doing it preemptively, but July, it's most of these forms are going to be very mandatory for you guys, which means that in your files, in advance of you showing a property, you're going to have a BRBC in place. We know that with that BRBC, you also need an agency relationship as well as a consent to represent more than one buyer and seller in that package. But that signing activity, and I know a lot of agents disagree with that, but that signing activity all by itself actually helps to solidify your relationship. Not only to mention the fact that it's going to position you as an expert. You're going to be able to ask more detailed questions of that buyer, which is going to showcase your expertise. And that's going to help you to really showcase your value proposition. Who feels that they're going to be fairly comfortable with working with buyers in this new method? Does anybody have any reservations about working with buyers as we move forward? But Haley, are you able? I see you unmuted. Good morning, Haley.
Yes. No, I don't have any qualms with what's going to happen in the market. As long as communication stays up to date and we're just transparent, I think it'll be a smooth process.
Absolutely. I think it'll be smooth as well. So let me ask you this, Haley. So I'm predicting a contraction of realtors in the market somewhere close to 500,000. What do you think about that?
I think some people are going to get scared and start changing careers.
For sure. Yeah, you've got folks who right now are already marginal, for lack of a better term, in terms of where they are from a business perspective. And they're going to start to either look at doing other forms of gig economy, or they may, in fact, go back to what they were doing prior to them being in real estate. And, Scott and I were talking about this a few weeks ago. Guys, that's a good thing. It's, I know it may seem negative on its face, but it's a really good thing for a couple of reasons. Real estate's an unusual business due to the fact that initially, to get your license, each one of you took a series of courses, 3 courses to be specific. And then, you set for 150 question examination, multiple choice, and then voila, you got a license. Many realtors don't do any study beyond that. They basically function from the principle of watching others do it. It's a social principle. They're not really learning everything. They're kind of doing things by rote or by observation. Oh, this person is doing this, so this must be the correct thing. We all know that many realtors have different ways of doing different things, and not always correctly. So because realtors don't really exercise the need to do further education, particularly if they're not doing business immediately, then they fail to learn. And then they're usually learning at the last minute, either when someone wants to write a contract or they have a listing interview, something like that. So, where I see the opportunity of this is you're going to have inexperienced practitioners jump out of the business, and for good reason. We all know that real estate is not as easy as everybody paints it. It's a very nuanced business. There's lots of complexities. There's aspects of law, even though we're not attorneys or legal authorities. At least in that sense, we have what's called special agency, meaning each and every customer we deal with, we're only authorized to deal within the framework of that transaction. So we're not, governing their lifestyle or anything like that. We've only got enough authority to transact that one piece of business, usually selling or helping them to purchase a piece of property. So, but but where the complexity comes in is, even though most of the language that we generate is pre-printed language that's been drafted by attorneys, and we're simply filling in the blanks, to be able to explain the complexities of what actually happens in a transaction is difficult. Even some of you struggle with a day-to-day, transaction, because there's so many different forms and there's so much legalese that we don't always interpret it correctly or have the ability to interpret it at all. So as we're looking at change right now, some of the forms that you're going to see in your forms library in the next 3 weeks or so has allowed for simplification of things that were even more complex. I mean, some of these forms have actually dumbed down, for lack of a better term, the language that we've used, to where there's less opportunity for interpretation and it's just being more detail oriented. So lots of check boxes, particularly around compensation. One thing I want to impress on all of you is you may want to start to adjust your language from commission to compensation. While there's no mandatory reason to do that, most of what we're talking about these days is how we're compensated. And commission, or at least the word commission, feels more like trigger language, versus it's much easier for you to articulate your value when you talk about compensation. Because to me, compensation implies I'm going to provide you with a particular product or service, and for that particular product or service, I deserve to be compensated, based on the actions that I perform. So I think it's going to help you from a conversational standpoint with your buyer or your seller to talk more openly about compensation based on the work that you do. I would also suggest, as you're looking at moving forward, is is everybody familiar with what's called a curriculum vitae? It's essentially kind of a historical resume of your life, essentially. I would encourage each and every one of you to craft a curriculum vitae, which really kind of outlines more of you as an individual versus these are the jobs I've had, or these are the companies I've been with. Many of you are incredibly talented, either from things that you've done in your life, careers that you've had, accomplishments that you've achieved, and those things need to be expressed. The reason I say that, think of other careers. Ever walk into a doctor's office and you've got diploma after diploma after diploma, on the wall? Those are someone showcasing, these are the things I've done. This is where I've been. This is the schooling I've had. Real estate, we have the same powerful license that a physician or a nurse may have, even though it's a different profession, because we have the ability to injure someone based on the activities that we do on a day-to-day basis, right? We're dealing with a large financial product and someone who tenuously has limited knowledge on how this large financial product should fit into their life portfolio. You're the advisor of that large financial product. The less we know, the more opportunity we stand to injure someone, as we're talking about helping them to negotiate that large life product, excuse me. So that curriculum vitae, even though it's going to be a digital kind of thing, as you start to have communications with your customer, just as it's important for you to know who that customer is that you're dealing with, particularly if it's a buyer, it goes beyond a wants and a needs assessment. As a matter of fact, that new document that will be introduced, which is about finance and personal information, it really talks about where down payments are going to be sourced, where deposits are going to be sourced. Is it coming from savings accounts, leveraging retirement accounts? Is it borrowed money or gifted money? It's really going to start to tear the covers back. And then it also starts to address, if the buyer is going to be paying your compensation, where is that money going to be coming from to pay your compensation? I know that the mortgage industry has gone through lots of conversation, just as our realtor trade organizations have done, to discuss options in terms of how compensation for buyer representation can be funded. Freddie Mac is actually talking about being able to give back up to 9%, or a buyer can ask for a concession of up to 9% of the purchase price. So when you're having conversations with sellers about concessions, right? And that's something that's relatively new. Normally, when we're dealing with someone from a listing perspective, we're not usually asking the seller, how much are you going to concess if it's a marginal buyer? Are you going to help the buyer pay for their closing cost? Are you going to help the buyer pay for X, right? Buyer and seller behavior are very different. The seller's looking to see what they're going to put in their pocket, and the buyer's looking to see what they can keep in their pocket. So one is a hard money number, and the other one is a soft money number. So when we're looking at receipt, it's just what the value supports, right? That's a soft money number. It's like you may want $1 million, but the market may only support $900,000, which is why it's a soft money event. Versus when it's hard money or actual money, that buyer is literally writing a check, so to speak, even if it's borrowed or leveraged funds. So that makes the two dynamics of a buyer and seller very different. You know, again, the buyer's looking to see what they can keep in their pocket, seller's looking to see what they can put in their pocket. So it's theoretically unnatural to ask for concessions up front. Some of you already do, or some of you have, but now you're introducing that new conversation of Mr. and Mrs. Seller. We may run into a buyer who absolutely loves the property and is otherwise qualified, but does not have the ability to compensate their buyer representation. Are you willing to provide or support additional funds in order to facilitate the sale of your property? We're going to have to start to have conversations like that, so everybody is in the know, right? And those feel like difficult conversations because, again, now we're talking about issues around money. This is why we all struggle so vehemently from time to time when we're either in a listing presentation or working with a buyer, because some of us find it difficult to negotiate. And the minute we start to talk about money, that creates a sub-negotiation, right? That's why we're always willing, or some of us are willing to discount our compensation almost immediately because we start to feel like there's pushback. But there's an old rule of thumb in sales, which is your job doesn't start until your first objection, right? So if it was just everybody saying yes to you all the time, essentially what we'd be is glorified order takers, right? We're not really challenged in any way. Every time we open our mouths, people are just saying yes to us. What a great business model that would be. I'd love it myself. But the reality is there is, even though we're not truly salespeople in that sense, we're really more lifestyle brokers than anything. Because that's what we're helping people get into, is a lifestyle. So there's an element of sales that actually exists within that framework. So, we're now having to exercise more effective sales tactics in order to secure our buyers or sellers at this point right now. If some of you are still kind of on the fence as to what next steps may look like, don't feel like you're alone. Everybody is in the same space right now. This is also new. And again, I've participated in lots of legal forums, lots of legal seminars in regards to the NAR settlement, both pre and post settlement now. And, even attorneys, MLS associations, realtor associations, we're all somewhat in the dark because there are still some gray areas, right? Again, the settlement was really based financially, even though there were components or aspects that met with the burden of proof. Not to say that we're guilty, or NAR did not espouse any guilt, but that actually said, all right, we're going to change these things that you plaintiffs and the Department of Justice feel that are objectionable, that is forcing you into creating this narrative that we're violating the Sherman antitrust law, right? And again, in some respects, that's what we do. I mean, any professional organization sets a standard of fee, right? Doctors don't necessarily work on a sliding scale, and I know this to be true. I used to work in medicine. Doctors don't work on a sliding scale. They set a fee schedule, right? And so as realtors, effectively, that's what we've done when we say, you know, my fee is 3%. Sure, that can be negotiated, but it doesn't have to be negotiated up front. We can clearly state what we feel our value is, but where it's gotten bastardized over time, and this is not NAR's first rodeo. There have been 3 separate lawsuits over years regarding antitrust. The first one that I can recall, not that I can physically recall, I wasn't around then, but that I'm aware of, better way to state that, happened in 1950. So because life was very different, right? Realtors were going from town to town, no such thing as a computer. Many realtors didn't have cars. They were driving and traveling on foot from town to town to get business, right? Suburbs were new, so you know, life was very different. It was very labor intensive for a realtor. So collectively, realtors at that time all colluded and said, hey, look, we feel the value of our service is easily worth X, which, you know, deemed to be 6%. And that 6% was predicated on the fact of, I am going to have to share money with this other practitioner who's, you know, going to be representing the buy side. Well, the federal government at that time, again, felt this is collusion, this is price fixing, and this is a monopoly, you know, violation of the antitrust law. So over approximately 4 years, from 1950 to about 1954, there was this protracted battle between the government and the National Association of Realtors about a change in policy. And at that time, that's when it was suggested that, you know, rather it be a mandatory 6%, it was a suggested price. So they used the word suggested to defeat or overcome the fact that the federal government was saying, hey, this is price fixing. So the word suggested changed everything for a period of about 10 to 12 years, somewhere in that time frame. And then in the 60s, it came up again. Same effect, same dynamic. Again, subtle changes in language kept everybody safe until the early 80s. And then once again, in the early 80s, you know, this collusion and this price fixing and all that. Now, fast forward to 2020 or 2018, which is when the first lawsuit of this new millennium happened. There'd been other conversations around this for a period of time. 2018 was the first lawsuit. It wasn't successful. It went on appeal. Appeals can take as long as 5 years, which is why we saw it go into effect in or around July, August of last year, and then a subsequent settlement that was $1.5 billion. And typically that $1.5 billion is, you know, when it's paid out is what's called trebled, or the amount is tripled. So that's how it got to the $4.5 billion. So long-winded, long story short, not the first time this has happened for NAR. NAR and the Department of Justice are not friends by any way, shape, or form. NAR is actually the third largest, most powerful lobbying organization in the United States. It is huge. It's got lots and lots and lots of power, which is, you know, again, you know, we wield a mighty axe. We wield a heavy sword. That's why, in my opinion, it's probably a good idea for us to remain with the National Association of Realtors. I know a lot of my realtor colleagues have expressed, you know, let's abandon ship. What are they doing for us? They didn't fight for us. Now we're under this settlement act. And again, the reason why NAR settled during this time frame is they would have had to come up with $4.5 billion just to continue with the appeals process. And they're not that liquid. Not to mention the fact of what does that do or say for us as its members. NAR explored bankruptcy as an option, which would have definitely screwed all of us on some level. You know, even though we try and keep business as usual, you know, there's the language of damage control, which is where NAR still is in, is the language of damage control, which is why some of you may be hearing conflicting information. And keep in mind, you have to trust where the source is coming from. So there's lots of media outlets that will want to sensationalize what this event's been. Right off the bat, you had major newspapers like the New York Times and other major syndicated periodicals that were saying NAR agrees to reduce its commission, and that wasn't what it was about at all, right? It was about the flexibility of, even though it's printed, at least in California, on every document we sign, it was the flexibility of money and the election of choice is what really happened. That's really what it was about. But news outlets made it seem as though we're charging more money than is necessary. And that's going to be a real conversation that you're going to have with your customer base is, well, I know you guys were charging more than you should have. What are you going to do for me? You're going to start to see that kind of conversation with your buyers and your sellers. And it's important that you talk about why there is, or at least understand where and how we've come up with a particular percentage of what we charge. So does anybody know why we charge approximately 3%, for our side, or somewhere in that range? You guys all have different fee schedules for your compensation, but does anybody know why we're looking at approximately 3% of the purchase price? Jess, good morning.
Hey, Dee,
Hey.
Liquidated damages.
Absolutely. Ding, dang, gold star. So what liquidated damages is, if some of you don't know, in the case of a breach, which means that you as the buyer, or were representing the buyer, failed to fulfill your obligation contractually, in other words, breached the contract after you've successfully negotiated terms and executed your contingencies, it's meant to resolve damages should in essence to make the seller whole. That's kind of where that's kind of where the 3% came from. And so what Jessica's actually talking about more specifically is the deposit versus the compensation. But that 3% of the purchase price is meant for liquidated damages. The 3% from our commission, literally, or for our compensation, literally rolls out based on the activity that we do. So there was a formula somewhere in the late 50s, early 60s that basically talked about and quantified what we do from a labor standpoint. And again, in the 1960s, it was very different. We didn't have a computer. There wasn't a collective MLS like that exists right now. That didn't really start until the mid 70s. So you literally had lots of driving around, lots of canvassing. In other words, lots of footwork, lots of windshield time, all that stuff existed. Even when I got in real estate, there was lots of windshield time. When I first got into real estate, it was just essentially a book that housed all of the listings. And in fact, they were actually like 3x5 cards, if most of you have seen those, that fit in kind of a Rolodex, and you were kind of scrolling through and you had a photo attached to these. And then they came up with a book that basically had all of the properties for sale that week or over the last couple of weeks. And you got a new book every week or every other week. And then the dawn of the internet age, to where there was a computer in every household, everybody had internet. The price of high-speed internet came down and it was available to all. So all of these things really crafted the real estate industry of today. And so where I'm going with this from a historical perspective is real estate was due for a change. Many of you have been in the business for less than 10 years, some of you right around 10 years. If you've been in the business for roughly 10 years, I'm going to give you even more conservatively, let's say call it 12 years, mostly all you've seen is an upmarket with very little change, because we were coming out of a really catastrophic period of time, and that was the financial collapse of the late 2000s that extended into roughly 2012, 2013. Well, as we started to recover, both economically and housing wise, you started to see prices escalate. Real estate was back to its glory days. Everybody wanted to jump in. Lots of things were happening during that time frame. So mostly all you've seen is an upcycle, including lots of practitioners who joined the business during this period of time. It swelled as far as membership in the national associations from about 1.3 million members to about 1.6. and some change members. So lots of bloat in the business itself. Again, you had lots of people who realized less opportunity for growth and change because there weren't a ton of brokers that were basically willing to train a newer practitioner. So they were kind of learning on the fly. They were learning on the cuff. And we went through COVID, COVID locked us down. It threw an artificial interest rate at many of us, right? Many homeowners took advantage of that. I know my personal interest rate is 2.25. I'm not changing for anything, right? Pry the gun for my cold dead hands, that kind of notion. But there's been lots of changes where I'm going with. And so now that we're recognizing change in real time for us, we're all concerned with what are the effects going to be overall. And again, I submit that the effects are going to be relatively minimal. I think it was Haley who said it's really all about communication at this point. In order to really articulate your value, many of you are going to have to up your communication skills. You're going to have to up your interview style to where you're able to easily elicit information and feel less discomfort as you're doing it. Many of us typically don't really want to delve into someone's personal finances because we feel it's invasive or it's intrusive. But guys, I'm telling you, it's part of your job. It should have always been part of your day-to-day routine. Yes, it's invasive, but the fact is you are helping someone to transact the largest financial purchase they'll probably make as an individual. And so it's important that we're very specific about the steps we make. I would actually advise each and every one of you to start being very judicious in how you're even representing yourself. I would start to use the words expert, skilled advisor, things like that. That's really going to separate you from the herd. Again, you're going to see a few lost souls for a few months, right? And again, this is across the board from regulators to associations to MLSs to brokers to us. You're going to see a lot of that because it's new for everybody. So we're trying to figure out all of the puzzle pieces and exactly what that means. And so there's not full clarity, but at least there's a framework that we can work from. So, like I said, I believe all of you are in California. Those of you who attended my forms course yesterday, you should have received, my dogs, you should have received the list of forms so that you can at least start to even look at the red lettered forms so that you can become familiar with the language. Right now, that's your biggest job, is to really embrace the documents so that you understand what they say and what they mean. And that generates additional conversation for you. Like, how is this form interconnected with this form? How do these all apply to one another to where I'm effectively working with my customer and giving them the right information and advice? So I'm going to put a pin in it there. Again, I can go on for hours. But what questions, if any, does anybody have? What are some of your major concerns? Cricket's quietness. Scott, go ahead.
You may have said this, and I didn't catch it, but have we got a timeline within the brokerage on when we're going to do these forms? I know we're starting to roll them out now and using the ones that we have.
Yeah.
A sense of when these drafts are going to be out?
Yes. So Jessica and her team, the compliance team, has already started to send out checklists of the new forms that we're going to implement now, and then ones we're going to implement at the end of the month or beginning of July. So all of the new forms, new and revised forms, will be fully fleshed out by June 26th of this month. So again, even the buyer-broker buyer compensation agreement, the BRBC, which is the one that you should mandatorily be signing right now each and every time you meet with a new buyer, that form is still the version from 12/22. So the language is very different in that form. I've had this conversation with a few agents where it says right here, and the reality is, and Jessica just put the link to the buyer compensation forms cheat sheet in the chat so that you can all access it. But the broker compensation form, the BRBC, is the one that's in the library now is from 12/22. So many of the points in that will change. So I want you guys to look at the red line that I sent out yesterday, the red line BRBC, so that you can at least get comfortable with the changes. Remember when I just started, I said there's 74 different forms that have been adjusted or changed. Keep in mind, they all connect to each other. Listing agreement connects to everything. So mostly the changes in a lot of these forms has been around compensation, right? Language has been removed of the automatic seller to, pay compensation to the buyer representation or the buyer representative. It's split out. They've unbundled a lot of that language to where it's like, that first negotiation is Mr. and Mrs. Seller. This is what you're going to be paying me. And, the following line to C says, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this is why I'm encouraging you to provide compensation to the buyer representative so that there's eyeballs. Now, this is one question I've gotten a lot, which is, we have a fiduciary capacity. In other words, we have a relationship of trust with our customers, buyer or seller. We have that relationship of trust, skill, care, diligence, the duties to account for all money, obedience, right? Those are those pillars of a fiduciary capacity or fiduciary relationship. So I've had agents ask me this several times over the last few weeks, which is, if we have that fiduciary relationship, irrespective of whether we get compensated or not, we still have to represent that person. And the answer is yes, we do. We have a fiduciary relationship irrespective of compensation once we establish agency. So it really goes about how we're establishing agency. You guys have heard me say this 1,000 times. Agency is established once a conversation becomes what's known as less than casual. A casual conversation is a conversation that goes something like this. Hey, D, how's real estate? And I say, real estate is phenomenal. It's excellent. That's a casual conversation because there's no specificity. It's very general, and it's not engaged in my professional capacity. When someone says, I've got a property on 1234 Main Street, I'm curious as to what its value is, or I'm curious about that house on 1234 Main Street, I wonder what its value is. Now that is no longer a casual conversation. It's what's known as a less than casual conversation. And it immediately establishes agency because all of you are not ordinary citizens, right? You are all special agents. You are superstars in your own right. But it does mean that it has engaged your professional license once you start to answer, because you're not ordinary citizens anymore. You are acting in your professional capacity, and there is no formula for opinion once you're licensed, right? You're licensed. It's the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, you're licensed. So that's a less than casual conversation, and it engages agency. So my suggestion is to start to look at that initial incept of conversation, and then start to look at a better practice of, let's get together so I can interview you. That way we can talk about, things like compensation. We can talk about what the buyer's true needs may be, or what the seller's true needs may be. Just like a listing appointment. We don't start to engage, or even a listing opportunity, we don't start to engage in less than casual conversation immediately, because we have to do a fair amount of homework in order to make sure that when we meet with them, we're actually talking about things correctly. We've priced the neighborhood correctly. We've priced their house as it fits in with the neighborhood. We've, evaluated the community of pluses and minuses. We're able to articulate effectively on what we feel the property would bring in the open market, which is what determines value. So we've done a lot of steps in between. So this is going to, again, force you into more effective opportunities of creating learning for your customer, because you're going to be doing a lot more interviewing, but it's a lot more on you. So Yeah. So, Scott, back to your point, June 26th, these forms will be live. Come July, we'll start to see some adjustments to the checklist that the compliance team has put together internally, that cheat sheet, which will allow you to know what what needs to be in your forms package. The other thing is that BRBC, again, it has to be signed before you show your buyer a property. Because of that, it also means that form needs to be approved by your broker. Your broker, in order to maintain compliance, has to have a copy of that document before you show a buyer a property, which means many of you are going to be changing part of your behavior in terms of how you submit a file. Somebody mentioned yesterday it's similar to PEDS. It's similar to PEDS in terms of process, right? Before we could go see a property during COVID, we had to sign that PEDS form. And I'm even forgetting what was on that form. Essentially, it was like, you're entering in the house and you're saying you're not actively ill, or, however it worked, how you guys know how it was. So the buyer broker agreement, or the BRBC, is similar in nature to the process. In other words, this form has to be completed in advance, but it's a lot more powerful than what that PEDS form is, because essentially it's you establishing a relationship with your buyer customer, and you're wanting to make that exclusive. Keep in mind, these forms are only valid for 3 months. In other words, you can only represent a buyer for a period of 3 months. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't renew. In other words, complete a whole new different buyer compensation form, or broker compensation form with that person. But, this is in advance of the new law for listings. Like, you can't take a residential listing any longer than 24 months come January 1, 2025. So, because there was a limitation to that, there's also a limitation to how long you can represent a buyer, which again is a good thing. Lots of conversation. How many of you have had that the client of indefinite duration, the buyer of indefinite duration? And, I submit again, that's because of a lack of understanding or a lack of education of that buyer, which means that we show them everything under the sun. And when we do that, buyers can't make decisions. They're paralyzed. So then they get caught in this endless loop. So it's going to force you to kind of start to reduce the amount of product that you're showing a buyer, because we know more often than not, buyers have a very difficult time making an informed decision when they're given too many options. So it really helps you to really define what that product is and what you plan to show the buyer. And I suggest not showing more than 3 to 5 properties in total, because you're the one really drilling down and getting very detailed. A 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, or 3-bedroom, 2-bath house looks very different even within the framework of what those parameters are. 3-bedroom, 2-bath house can be a 700 square foot house or a 7,000 square foot house. So the more specifics you get into, the more you're going to be able to define the product, which means that that's going to reduce the amount of windshield time that you have with your buyer customer. So that's all I have for you guys in regards to the change of landscape. It's not necessarily NAR driven, but it is. The forcing event was the change of NAR and the lack of the ability to be able to put any form of compensation in the MLS. That's really what the change is, that forced the event of how you practice. And again, it's really only forcing you to step up and do a little bit more in terms of what your business is. My final question: do all of you plan on staying in the business through the change? I know that's an odd question, but definitely just a curious one. Of course, I knew Scotty would. The rest of you?
Yep.
Yay. Grace, what market are you in?
I actually just moved from Arizona back to California.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, the LA, Orange County area, which is pretty best.
Sure, it is.
But hey, whatever comes, I'm taking it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you guys started to see your business pick up a little bit? I know we talked yesterday a little bit about inventory. Inventory has definitely started to increase over time. So that's an opportunity. But, again, all of you in California, keep in mind, only about 11% of Californians can afford to actually buy something here in California. Crazy, crazy number, but it is what it is. So, any other questions, guys? I hope this was somewhat useful.
Yeah, I didn't get the attachment for the forms that were revised. If I could get that in the cheat sheet too, whatever you have, I would really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
so I believe the link for the cheat sheet was dropped in the chat. So if you go to the extreme right of your toolbar, the second tab to the right, there is a link that will take you. It's under Jessica DeFerrari. That will take you to the cheat sheet. And then
Great.
I will have Ela send out again the forms library, the new forms library. Keep in mind, most all of the forms that I'm describing right now are still in draft or red lettered until the 26th of this month.
Right.
So it'll be a few days before they're actually live and in person.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Everybody, I really appreciate you taking some time out to spend some time with me today. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out if you've got any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Appreciate
Always a
it.
pleasure.
Bye, guys.
Bye.